So thank you so much to all those in the dicastery who organised this under your leadership, Bruno Marie. But of course, our greatest thanks to Pope Francis for Laudato Si, quite extraordinarily important intervention. Intervention is not a good word, act of leadership in this whole story, which changed the discussion fundamentally in a good direction. I speak here as an economist of no particular faith, but someone who deeply shares the values embodied in Laudato Si. Sometimes to say you're an economist in these groups is not a good way to start. It's a bit like, Alcoholics Anonymous. My name is Nick, I'm an alcoholic. My name is Nick, I'm an economist. But in your introduction, Bruno Marie, you were very clear that this is so much about economic decision-making and investments. And we have to get the economics right. But economics comes from, or is based on, an understanding of the problem at hand. And here the science is fundamental. But also, you can't talk about economic policy without talking about values. And we have to recognize both these things, the science and the values. Otherwise, we have nothing to say. So let me try. I'm going to talk about three things: the urgency and scale, secondly, economic development and the Sustainable Development Goals, and climate and how they interweave. That'll be the bulk of what I have to say. But lastly, I want to spend a little time at the end on communication and engagement, because I think looking ahead, what we see is something extraordinarily attractive in terms of changing the ways we're doing things. As you said, Bruno Marie, very clearly changing the way in which we live, produce, and invest. And we have extremely attractive alternatives ahead of us. Of course, if we get it wrong, it's deeply, deeply dangerous. And that I hope we can be clear on, although we must communicate on it. But what is not clear is the political will. So that's the challenge, and we have to engage and persuade, get our arguments right on the back of good arguments. So I'll spend the last few minutes of what I have to say on that story. So those are the three parts. Now, let me just give you the storyline at the beginning. After the Second World War, the world got together, imperfectly of course, but the world got together to create a spirit of internationalism and a new international economic order. After the devastation of 30 years with 2 world wars and a Great Depression, and it was clear that we had to do better, and that involved not the vulgar, destructive, aggressive nationalism that had blighted those 30 years, but actually an internationalism, a getting together to solve the big problems. Or solve may be too strong, but rise to the big problems of the world. And my goodness, it was extraordinarily successful. Life expectancy increased from around 40 years, the world as a whole, to around 70. Extraordinary. It went up about 5 months every year. Extraordinary in human history. Income per capita, and of course, people stopped dying premature deaths, and population went up. But it went up for a good reason. People weren't dying early. In that period, output per capita, crudely, conventionally measured, went up by a factor of 4. Those two things, 40 to 70 on life expectancy, quadrupling of income per capita. So multiplying by 12, population went up by a factor of 3. Multiplying by 12, total output. That was an extraordinary period of success relative to those dimensions. Of course, something else was happening at the same time. Because of that success, we put intense pressure on the global commons. And it's that pressure that we must now take on board. We should have started at least 30 years ago. Some of the great minds, the great visionaries in science, saw that long ago. James Hansen, we've got Bill McKibben here. They saw it way back. But we came to it as a world far, far too late, which makes this next 20 years now the most important 20 years in human history, in my view. We can make that change. If we fail to make that change, we're in deep, deep trouble. So that's the basic storyline, and let me go through it fairly quickly. The urgency, let me begin with the urgency. This is essentially what John Schellenhuber was talking about. We have to peak emissions very soon. We have to cut them by at least 30%, arguably more, in the next 30 years. And we have to go what's crudely called net zero around 40 or 50 years from now. Net zero means balancing sources and sinks in the language of the Paris Agreement. Peak very soon, cut by 30% the next 20 years or so, more than 30%, and go to net zero. Those are the things we have to carry away. Those give us a really clear picture of the magnitude of the emissions change that we have to make. And if we're going to get to net zero in 50 years, big parts of the world, big parts, have got to get to it much earlier than that, because there'll be other parts that get to it later than that. So that's why going to net zero is a hugely important part of the story. And one thing that Vatican City could do would announce an early target to get to net zero. That's what we mean by leadership. And I hope that will come. Next, just looking around the world at the CO2 emissions, some things have changed. I've been working in China for 30 years. I've been working in India very intensively for 45 years. China's understanding of these issues and acting on these issues changed 5, 6, 7 years ago. In India, it changed 2, 3, 4 years ago, but it's changed. Those are the two most, I always often start my lectures at LSE saying the two most important countries in the world, China, and then I pause, and then I say India, because obviously, in terms of any reasonable criterion of human beings, that is, those two are the most important countries of the world. They are the ones that are going to grow the most rapidly in the coming years. And they're changing. China's emissions have plateaued because of the last 15 years. Before they plateaued, they're at a very high level. But China's understood not only the danger, but also the attractions of the alternative path. They'll say to you, what's the point of all this growth if we've got cities that are unlivable? Very clear. And that change is happening in India too. So it's a realization of the desperate consequences of climate change. Those countries depend critically, for example, on the water off the Himalayas. That will change radically when those snows and glaciers go, or if those snows and glaciers go. They understand they're both coastal, depopulated countries. They understand very clearly the consequences of climate change, but they see also how damaging it is to the air pollution that they have to tackle with. But actually, both countries are seeing the attractions now of doing things differently, and they both see the huge potential in solar and wind and so on, and of course a huge potential in not wasting things, being much more efficient in the way we do things, including via circular economy. So that change is something that we have to recognize. China promised in Paris to peak in 2030. I think they'll peak about 2020, 2022. They're actually plateaued. It's bouncing around a little bit. It's not started to charge down, but I think they'll start to go down in 2020, 2021. We should be partnering. We should be respecting and partnering, similarly with India and developing countries around the world. And we should be showing our examples, sharing our technology. So we know that there's some worrying goings on in the United States, but we should look around the world. It's not the only place that matters, and we've got many friends in the United States, cities, firms who are getting on with the job. So as we recognize we're moving far too slowly, we must also recognize there's an awful lot that is happening. So there's a momentum to build on. There is something to accelerate, but my goodness, we really have to accelerate. But there's something there to work on. Delay is extremely dangerous for the reasons by now you're familiar with. You know, this is a ratchet effect. The flows of emissions go into the stocks of concentrations, and it's very hard to get them out. It's a flow stock problem. The later you leave it, the bigger is the stock you're dealing with, and it's the stock that's causing the climate change. If the later you leave it, the longer you lock in high carbon infrastructure. And the later you leave it, the more devastating are the many irreversible effects that will occur. So let me turn to the growth and development. Now, this slide is the growth. So I've spent a lot of time in China, so I sometimes talk about the three doublings. What are the three doublings? Our infrastructure will double in 15 years, our world economy will double in 20 years, our world cities population, urban population, will double in 40 years, and they will be shaped in the next 20. That's why I said the next 20 years are fundamental. Infrastructure more than doubles, the economy roughly doubles, our towns and cities will double in 40 years in terms of population, but be shaped in the next 20 years. At the same time as we have to cut emissions by at least 30%. It surely is crystal clear that this is about radical change. It must be crystal clear simply from those numbers, the three doublings plus the cutting by 30% in 20 years. It couldn't be clearer. We have to do things differently. If that new world economy that we add in 20 years looks anything like the one we have at the moment, we won't cut by 30%, we'll add by 50, 60, 70%. So I think those numbers make it crystal clear that we have to change. And we have to change by breaking the relationship. As Chair described right at the beginning, breaking the relationship between economic activity and the damage it does to the environment. And we can, and we know how to do that. This is the relationship to the Sustainable Development Goals. If we try to explain what we mean by development, it's the Sustainable Development Goals, which we should take as our basic understanding of what that means. Right across the story of human capital, health and education, the reduction in hunger and the growth in incomes, tackling the inequality, taking on the oceans and the problems, oceans and forests and so on. They're a good set of definitions of what development is all about, and more than 190 countries signed up to them. Heads of government. The finance ministers don't know what the objectives of development are. We should introduce them to the Sustainable Development Goals and point out to them that it was their heads of government that agreed to those just 3 years or so ago. It's not perfect, but basically the sense of direction is a good one. What does sustainability mean? Sustainability means offering to the next generation similar opportunities that you had, assuming that they behave in the same way to the generations that follow them. That's what sustainability means. It's a very clear definition. What does it depend on? It depends on the capital that we leave to the next generation. And what are the dimensions of that capital? Human capital and physical capital, clearly part of that story. Social capital, cohesiveness, trust, governance kind of issues. And natural capital, our forests and our oceans and so on. Well, our human capital and our physical capital have gone up strikingly. That's where I began. But our social capital, I'll leave that to you to judge. Are we less cohesive, less trusting societies than we used to be? Maybe. But our natural capital, there's no maybe. We've depleted that quite extraordinarily. So we're now in a position where, if we're talking about sustainability, the kick upwards in human capital and physical capital, good, we should, but we've now got very serious questions as whether those other forms of capital are depleting so rapidly that they're offsetting the human and so I'm not arguing that we stop doing the human and physical capital, but I am arguing that we take much more care. And we, instead of disinvesting in our natural capital, we invest in our natural capital. And of course, so in so doing, we build more cohesive communities. Actually, the act of looking after our natural capital makes our communities more cohesive. You can't reuse and recycle outside a community. You haven't got public transport outside a community. You can't use combined heat and power outside a community. Much of what we have to do to look after our natural capital, our forests and so on, and the way we act to protect our oceans, much of what we do is acting together. We will actually build social capital at the same time as we look after our natural capital. You don't need me to remind you that the costs of action have just crashed. Yeah? When I wrote the Stern Review, I said with my colleagues, we wrote that the costs of action are much less than the costs of inaction. I underdid it. I underdid that story. The costs of action are lower than we thought, and the costs of inaction are higher than we thought. And it's not just the costs of the solar modules or the wind, it's the storage costs are crashing down too. It's been transformed. It's been very powerful around the developing world, that story, but it's also been very powerful in other places too, including my own country, let it be said, in the UK. It's not just the cost technology by technology. Fundamental importance here is, and this is the economist talking, it's the cost of capital. If the cost of these new technologies are 80%, 90% capital because the running cost is free if it's wind or solar, if you bring down the cost of capital by a factor of 2, say from 8% real to 4% real, and we know how to do that too, it's not technology, it's economics and good policy, then you crash down the cost of those things. Normally when people write down the cost of this or the cost of that, buried underneath of that is some assumption about the cost of capital. It's our duty to act on that, and we know how to. More stable policies reduce the cost of capital. Cost of capital is about risk. So more stable policies reduce risk. The presence of a multilateral development bank in a deal reduces risk, because governments, are the main source of risk actually, are less likely to monkey around if a multilateral development bank is there. It's also, you get into the technicalities of how you use equity and political risk guarantees and long-term loans and how they migrate. That's a kind of technical thing which makes people's eyes glaze over, but actually it matters. So we do know a lot about how to bring down the cost of capital, and in so doing, we will bring down the cost of these alternative technologies. So the technicalities actually do matter. We have to send out the signal, and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure does that. Send out the signal that the dirty technologies are seriously risky. You put your money there, you're making, because you're a pension fund, you are risking the future welfare of your pensioners, because those technologies are more and more risky because A, climate change itself, but B, governments are slowly, not as fast as we would wish, but moving over time in the direction that we'll have to give up on those things. Whether it be bans on the sale of the internal combustion engine vehicle by, say, 2030, as in India, mayors are saying they can't come into city centres after a certain date. Those are the kinds of things that we see, as it were, making those investments much more risky. Of course, it's not just about the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, it's also the air pollution, and that is wicked. John Schellenhuber said something about that. I've emphasized that this is the growth story and very close to the development story. Well, this is of fundamental importance. I've already said that they're interwoven. But investing in sustainable infrastructure, which is at the core of the story, is boosts investment, boosts demand, sharpens supply. It spurs innovation in the medium term, and we know that low carbon growth is a contradiction in terms because it creates, high carbon growth is a contradiction in terms because it creates an environment so hostile that it destroys growth and undermines living standards. This is the growth story. It is the story of a very different way of doing things. So it's not only did I understate in the Stern Review that the costs of actions are much less than the cost of inaction, the cost of action are much, much less than the costs of inaction. But there's also now, as we can see as times have moved on, a growth story here, which is of an extremely attractive kind. Not any old growth, sustainable and inclusive growth, and we know what that means, and not growth forever. That's a difficult concept. I'm talking about 2 or 3 years from now. 2 or 3 decades from now for the growth story. After that, we have another look, but we can see how to do it in that time. So let me say something very briefly about communication. This is a very difficult thing to communicate on because the scale of impact is outside human experience. It's large risk and uncertainty, and humans are not good at thinking about that. They're long lags, and humans are not good at thinking about that. And it's a public thing. It's the addition of all these things coming together, all the emissions coming together. For all those reasons, it's actually quite a difficult thing to communicate on. We haven't done badly, but we should do much better. Academics have a crucial role in this whole story of communication. We have to do much better, not just talk to ourselves in technical language. There are many good examples. Maynard Keynes said it's much been more important to be roughly right than precisely wrong. He attacked the Treaty of Versailles because of what it did to the future of Europe, and he was absolutely right. It led to warfare. He said, don't look back in reparations, look forward to the growth of the economies. Stephen Hawking told us to look up at the stars, not down at your feet. Mahatma Gandhi told us how to communicate by walking. In many other ways, he didn't have social media, he didn't have access to the radio, but he was very clear and strong. And above all, and we've also heard about Nelson Mandela that John Schellenhuber quoted earlier today. And of course, Pope Francis has been quite extraordinary in his ability to communicate. So we have to be very clear that there's a very optimistic story here, but we have to be about what we can do, but we have to be very clear that we've got real problems about what we will do. So our challenge is how to accelerate the political will. And this is my last slide. We have to mobilize and have coalitions and set the arguments right across the board. We have to talk about a just transition. We can't just tell people there are more jobs in renewables than there are in coal mines and expect the coal miners to take us seriously. Or they might take us seriously, but they might take us in a hostile way. There's so much we can do about investing in people, investing in change. We know how to do that, but we must do it. We can't leave it to one side. Huge potential in the financial sector that I've already remarked on. Must remember that sustainable investing in firms that take sustainability and responsibility seriously is to invest in firms that show a higher return. Not surprising, if people are irresponsible on one dimension, they're probably irresponsible on another dimension. And actually going after sustainability is going after the profitable things of the future. The investors increasingly see that. I'm at a university, and one of the things about universities is that your pupils stay the same, your students stay the same age as you get older, and they are quite extraordinarily clear on this subject, and that gives me great cheerfulness at schools and universities. And finally, as we've seen, which is the reason we're here, because of Laudato Si, moral leadership is of fundamental importance. We can create the political will, but we have to work very hard to do it and together to do it. Thank you.